Hello and welcome to Mum's Work and Chaos with me, Louise. They say it takes a village to raise a child, so let me help you build yours. During this journey, I'll be learning about everything from neurodiversity in children's literature through to body image post-pregnancy. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to this episode of Mum's Work and Chaos with me, Louise. Today I'm joined by Charlotte. She's a speech therapist and she's just fabulous. So Charlotte, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, so nice to be here. Thanks for having me, Louise. I'm Charlotte and I am a speech therapist and founder of Speech Therapy with Charlotte. So I am I'm a speech and language therapist and I work to support children's communication skills. But with my project, Speech Therapy with Charlotte, I'm really looking at primarily supporting parents who are waiting for speech therapy appointments for their kids, because we know that there's lots of kids who need help at the moment and not enough therapists to offer that help, unfortunately, at the moment. There's so many families who are getting in touch to say that they're waiting for speech therapy and they don't know what to do, and they're feeling frustrated and worried and a bit helpless and overwhelmed. And I'm a parent too, so I can completely understand and relate to that. So I really just want to kind of be able to provide information to educate and empower parents so that they feel confident, that they know how to support kids, particularly if they're waiting for speech therapy. Those parents can feel like they're not just like sitting around waiting, and actually using that waiting time productively.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? Like COVID affected us in, all sorts of ways, but I've also found that like we're now behind with waiting for speech therapy for my eldest. She's 7, she's in year 2. Originally it was brought to my attention when she was in nursery that we should seek help. She was born with posterior tongue tie, as were my other 2. So I'm just waiting to see how their speech and language develops as they grow. But she's got that classic sort of noise when she pronounces S words. And so we originally went to the session, everything was sort of looked at, they got her to pronounce certain words, but she was, how old was she? She was 3, nearly 4 when we went. And so certain sounds she hadn't even developed yet. So it's really difficult to judge that, isn't it? That was the February. Then we went into COVID lockdown and she couldn't have her July appointment because they weren't doing in person or even video appointments at that time. So we brought it to the school's attention in reception when she joined school. And again, they have been monitoring the situation, but not really giving me any updates, which is frustrating. We're currently going through an ADHD referral for her. And as part of that, I then brought to the SENCO's attention about her speech and language and whether she felt that it needed attention. To which she informed me she was already monitoring the situation, but that speech and language therapy was so oversubscribed in the area because the teams had been depleted so heavily throughout the COVID situation, due to retirement and maternity leave and not being able to hire people into NHS positions. It just meant that the waiting lists were ridiculous, considering that there was like a 2-year wait on top because of the COVID issue anyway. So she's now finally been referred. They opened up their referrals again recently, but it seems that they're now playing catch up. So I'm in that situation. I'm a waiting mum, and trying to navigate that. And I think as well, on top of your usual mental load duties of emptying the dishwasher, doing the laundry, making sure they actually get to the dentist and everything else, searching the interwebs for information and help about speech and language is just like another thing on top. So being able to find a professional like yourself on Instagram, being able to find your podcast, which is amazing because it's so quick and easy to digest as well, it just makes life so much easier. So personally, for me, it's been really, really helpful. Just your podcast is so it's in those bite-sized chunks, isn't it? So they're like not anything more than sort of 15-minute episodes, aren't they? Just so parents like myself have the actual time to to find the information that we need.
That's the whole premise of the podcast, actually. So it's called Just Three Things, and it's sort of like 10 to 15-minute episodes with I'm just focusing, taking a question from a parent and answering with just 3 things that you can do. Because I think that, as well as, you know, you said like searching through the internet, not really knowing what's good quality advice, what you should be doing, but also sometimes there's too much advice. And actually, if you're feeling overwhelmed already and you don't know where to start, there might be 10 things that you can do. But actually, if we're just starting with 3, then that's maybe a bit more achievable. And as I said, you know, I'm a parent too, and there's definitely times where I'm in the same position, not knowing what I'm meant to do about something, and actually it's hard to know where to start. And I think, yeah, I just want to simplify the process for everyone. It's a labor of love, this, for me. You know, I've worked in the NHS for more than 14 years, and I did leave at the end of 2021, so I'm just like almost 18 months into working for myself. So this is sort of my way to still continue to like give back.
Yeah, no, it's really difficult, and with all the budget cuts within the NHS and everything as well, it must be a really difficult decision to have to make, to actually leave so that you can, you know, pursue something that's going to be, I don't know, more beneficial in the long run to your own family and your own living situation. You know, we're all suffering from the cost of living crisis at the moment, and unfortunately NHS pay just doesn't necessarily cut it anymore, which is insane. But yeah, I digress. So I suppose, really, like, I'll get in first. Like, our listeners have sent questions in, but but since I've already given the intro into our own situation, I guess, really, like, when we went for that first assessment, we were sort of told that it's really difficult to diagnose a child with a lisp before, now I remember it this way, but tell me if I'm wrong, before the age of 9. And their reasoning behind it was that their adult teeth haven't fully grown in, and they've got more space sort of at the back of the jaw for their tongue to lie flat and make that noise. And so it's difficult to assess whether a child has actually officially got a lisp before that age. But then equally, you sort of have to start doing something about it earlier on, because after that age, it's difficult to then get them out of the lisp in the first place. So it's sort of a catch-22 situation at that point, isn't it?
I can see that that's really confusing.
Yeah.
So there's a few things that I want to kind of pick apart there. So I get lots of questions from people using this word lisp. And I think people use the word lisp to mean lots of different things, and lisp isn't really a technical term. It's not a word as a speech therapist that we tend to use. We might use the phrase interdental lisp, which is specifically when you have your tongue coming out between your teeth. Lots of young children do that one. You'd have seen it like sausages rather than sausages. But really, when we're thinking about kind of speech sound differences, we are thinking of kind of other things that might go on. So some of the things that you might have heard of are things like oral or verbal dyspraxia. We might be thinking about just like a speech sound delay. Some people use that terminology to say that the kids are using sounds that we typically see of a slightly younger child. Also, kind of in terms of medical terminology, there is also this idea of like speech sound disorders where they're not following that typical pattern of development. But the word lisp, I think, it isn't really a kind of medical term or a term that speech therapists would use. So in terms of like the age at which you'd expect that to resolve, I would find that one difficult to quantify, because it's not something that we use. I think something that's really important, because, and I talk about this a lot in episode 1 of my podcast, so do go to that if you want a bit more, but we need to also kind of go back to thinking about speech and language skills as like a complete picture. So as parents, particularly parents who aren't speech therapists, I appreciate that's not me, we tend to notice whether or not our children are talking or not talking, or maybe not using as many words as the other kids their age, or how clear and smooth their speech is, whether they're pronouncing the words correctly, and often we can see if they're stuttering or stammering. But actually they're just like the tip of the iceberg, if you like. There's lots of kind of other skills going on below the surface. So things like the way that they're interacting socially with other people, whether they've got any kind of attention and listening needs, whether we need to support their concentration, whether they understand what other people are saying, whether or not they've got the vocabulary, and whether they understand different grammatical structures. They're all things that we need to look at and potentially work on first before we'd actually address things like speech sound difficulties. Because when young children start to talk, their speech is not as clear as adults. So young children do things to make the words easier to say. So you'll know if you've got a young child, or if you've had a young child, that when they started talking, perhaps you could understand what they were saying, but other people couldn't. And that's because they don't have that full repertoire of speech sounds. And it's usually through practice talking that becomes clearer. So if you imagine you're learning to play tennis, for example, you might start off just trying to hit the ball with the racket. And then gradually you're going to be hitting the ball across the net to the other side. And then when you're like a bit more of a pro, you're actually going to be like making calculated decisions about exactly where you're aiming for that ball to hit on the other side of the tennis court. And that's the same with speech sound development. You know, you're starting off and you're just giving it a go. And then as you get talking and you do more practice, then you're really thinking about how to move the articulators in different ways. I'm so sorry. I feel like my camera's just stopped working. I don't know if that's a problem for you.
You do look like you've frozen.
And now I've gone altogether.
No.
Sorry. Should we keep chatting without the camera, or?
Yeah, or try turning the camera on and off again, see if that helps.
Yeah, I have.
Oh, okay.
Just seems to have broken.
Well, that's annoying. Don't worry, we can carry on chatting, and I can edit this interlude bit out as well, so it doesn't matter. We can keep going. No,
so in terms of the speech sounds, what we really need to think about is whether or not a child needs any support in any other areas first as well. So that's where it is really helpful to actually get an assessment from a speech therapist. So I would always try and say to people, if you're feeling unsure as to like where your child's difficulty is, even if you're told by everyone that it's impossible to get a speech therapy referral, still try to get one. Because I think sometimes people are like, oh, there's no point, we're going to be waiting for ages, including, unfortunately, sometimes schools, childcare settings. Maybe they've been told there's no point in trying to refer, but actually there's often ways that parents can refer themselves, their own children, to speech therapy. So I would like go straight to the horse's mouth, if you like. I would like do an internet search for speech and language therapy in the town in which you live, and see what comes up, because there might be a way for you to contact the speech and language therapy service directly. And even if you do have to wait 2 years, which definitely isn't the case in every part of the country, you're on the list. You know, if you you need to get a specialist assessment sometimes. That's why speech and language therapy exists. So you do need to do that bit, but on top of that, there are other things that you can be doing at home and in school to support these kids. And again, I think like because we're all overwhelmed as parents and teachers, we know that they're really overworked as well. Sometimes there's this just like, oh well, we've done the referral, like let's park that for a bit. And actually no, there are lots of things that both as parents and educators you could be doing in the day-to-day that could make a huge difference to child's speech and language development.
It's funny, isn't it? Because it is, from my own experience, it's more getting into the routine of like actually actively listening to the way your child is pronouncing words, because as you said, as parents, we tend to understand our kids more than other people would if they're pronouncing things slightly differently or not necessarily hitting that exact sound. So I have that at the moment with my 3-year-old. She's her language, her vocabulary is really expanding exponentially at the moment. She's chatting a lot with her older sister. She's very chatty at nursery as well. And she's become a lot more vocal at home. You know, she's the middle child, she needs to be heard. But she's really starting to try and have those like active conversations with you as well. And so she'll like come up to me in the morning and she'll be like, oh, Mummy, I love your top. and
That's so
things like that. But we're sort of finding that she's saying things to certain people, like my mum or other relatives that she doesn't see as often, and they're like, oh, what did she say? And I remember going through this exact thing with my eldest as well, where people didn't necessarily understand everything that she said either. But when we went through the beginnings of our speech and language sort of journey with our eldest, we were able to access speech and language help through a walk-in centre, through a walk-in session at our local community centre. So again, it's worth checking, searching the internet and seeing like what your local council even offers, because that session was completely free. We had the beginnings of an assessment to then see how she progressed over the next 6 months, to then see whether she could then have a referral. Unfortunately, as I said previously, all of that fell apart due to COVID, but she's since been referred by the school. So clearly they think that she needs a little bit of extra help in certain areas. But I find as well, like asking her about her school day, or we have to read with her a couple of times a week as well outside of school. And so even like sitting there and listening to her read, you can sort of like catch when she's mispronounced a word, or at the moment she's going through that phase that all the kids in her class are going through, of adding ed to the end of everything. I asked, I wrote it, I did, I did this, I climbed it up this thing. So sort of at the moment, a lot of our time is sort of like catching her adding this added ed to the end of words, and correcting that as well, and getting her to repeat that back to us to make sure that she's not adding this extra, extra unneeded element.
About that, Louise, can
Yeah.
I kind of, so with this, because there'll be things throughout your children's development when they're learning a new thing that they sort of, we call it overgeneralization. They'll learn, she's just learned that there's this rule that you add ed onto the end of things. But unfortunately English language is really complicated and not everything follows the rule, so that's where you get these things. So there'll be things like this that come up again and again. And the most important thing for children's language learning and development is that they're regularly taking part in good quality interactions. And that's really important because we want to build them into confident communicators. So we want to be trying to listen attentively. And I know you were saying, Louise, like that's really hard because we've already got this like mental load, we're doing this juggle. So what I really try and recommend, and I know this in itself feels like a lot for some people, is having like 5 minutes a day of one-on-one time with your child. And it doesn't have to be to do any particular activity, but it's where you're actually doing that. You were saying listening to what your child is really saying. So if you can have 5 minutes of like, right, this is now this child's time, I'm going to actually respond kind of positively and really listening to what they're saying, because that really helps to build their sense of worth as well, and like that you're really listening and you value what they're saying. But when they're doing those, whether it's mispronouncing a speech sound or making a grammatical error, what I would recommend is that you kind of like repeat back what they've said, giving the correct model, because then you're showing them that you listened and you're just modeling it for them. But I wouldn't actually recommend like stopping the conversation, telling them they've got it wrong and getting them to repeat that to you, because that disrupts the flow of conversation and can be a bit frustrating, particularly if you're really trying hard to like learn a new skill or learn a new thing. Actually, it's really annoying when you're in the middle of trying to say something and then somebody's interrupting you to be like, it's not rotated, it's right. You say right.
Well, that's generally the way we do it. So that was another thing that we sort of like have come across with her as well, is that as part of the whole ADHD thing as well, being interrupted means you lose your mental flow, as it were. And so if you're interrupted during that thought process, you then get quite frustrated, because then you're like, well, I was talking about something, and what was I talking about? Yes, I was talking about unicorns. Where did I get to in this element of the conversation about unicorns? I can't remember now. And that break is frustrating. And so generally, if she said something that isn't quite right, I'll be like, oh, so you walked to the, you walk to the climbing frame with Tilly and Nushi. Oh, okay, fantastic. That's brilliant.
That's
Then what
perfect.
happened?
Yeah,
And so it's trying to like, yeah, like as exactly as you said, add the correction into the conversation without necessarily saying, oh no, it's not Ed
exactly.
at the end of that, it's this, so
Exactly, that's perfect. And it's a really subtle difference. I just wanted to like point that out because
yeah,
it's quite subtle. And I think that the two things can get confused, but they're actually quite different and have quite a different outcome for a child. So the difference is, just to model it once more for anyone who's listening and feeling a bit confused. She said, I I wrote it down on that piece of paper that I wanted a unicorn.
yeah,
So what not to do would be like, no, you didn't wrote it down. You wrote down. Can you say wrote? Say it back to me. Okay.
yeah,
What you do want to do is, oh wow, you wrote it down. That's cool. And then yeah, then what happened? Like you're just showing that you're listening, you're modeling the correct pronunciation or the correct grammatical use, and then you're moving on. And it's through that constant modeling that children are gonna learn.
yeah. I know that being interrupted myself, I find that really frustrating, um and that change of tack as well, conversation like throws me off too. So I try and avoid it as much as possible. And then another thing that my husband and I do is on the weekends, if we have to do a bit of a top-up shop, food shop, he'll take one or two of them, and then I'll be left with one or two. And then that does generally afford us the time to have like a more in-depth conversation, and for whichever child the other one has to have that extra time with us. So we do try and have individual time with them, like even during the week is fairly difficult, because of nursery, coming home from nursery, bedtime, tea time, all of that stuff. But generally, we collect our eldest from school, have a couple of hours with her before the younger ones come home. And so she has that sort of like in between time with us as well,
Yeah.
where we can, do some reading or spend some time with her, which is fabulous. And I think that also sort of like helps with, being able to express herself more freely, I guess, and explain, situations that might be frustrating to her at school, or things that she's experienced. Like one of our listeners has sent in a question saying like she's struggling with getting her child to express how they're feeling. Necessarily, she has a poster with emotions on, but she does end up with her child would end up more likely growling or clenching their teeth instead of actually explaining why they're frustrated. And personally, I'd say having that extra sort of like, if they can afford to do it, having that little extra bit of one-on-one time with that particular child would help, wouldn't it? But do you have any advice around that?
Yeah, I think on that one-on-one time, I love the example that you've given there of like dividing and conquering and taking one of the kids shopping and not the others. Because it's sometimes it takes a bit of planning to work out how you could possibly have this one-to-one time, particularly if you've got more than one child, particularly if there's not more than one of you, parents, co-parents, adults. But it's those little moments, and even if you can only do it once a week, that is still something. Like that's great. And I think like my one-to-one times are often getting the kids dressed, because I happen to do that a bit more, like when I'm just in the room with one of them, getting them dressed, and then I'll just try and like mindfully be really responsive during that one-on-one time. So that's just a note on one-on-one time. I saw this question from this person as well, and I think I just wanted to address it. I think that the question was specifically about getting them to verbally express. She wanted them to verbally express their emotions. And I just kind of wanted to talk that through a bit, because when any of us are stressed or experiencing heightened emotions, which actually can be positive, like those emotions that we think of as positive, things like excitement, joy, that sort of thing, those are heightened emotions as well. And actually, when any of us are experiencing any sort of heightened emotions, it can be really difficult for us to actually kind of do all sorts of things, learn, develop, grow, but equally communicate and express ourselves. So in that moment, it's very hard to use your rational brain. sometimes you need to like think about it more at points of calm. So one thing I would say is if you're wanting to develop kind of like emotional vocabulary, firstly, the best thing that you can do is by modeling use of that sort of vocabulary yourself. So talking about like, oh, I'm feeling happy, I'm feeling sad, that sort of thing, using your own emotions or labeling what you can see other people are feeling, although emotions are a bit subjective. So I might incorrectly label to my daughter, I can see you're really sad, and she actually might be angry. So
Yeah.
it is a bit of a tricky one to model. So I would say start off with modeling your own emotions, but do it at a point of calm. So actually often talking about it in the moment for your child, particularly if they're experiencing those heightened emotions, what you really need to focus on at that moment is just regulating and like getting back to that point of calm. And then you can maybe explore the vocabulary around it at a different time. Probably in the moment's not the right time because your brain is just kind of functioning on kind of like survival at that time.
It is
So
tough,
this
isn't it?
person said that they had a poster, which sounds like it's maybe like pictures of different emotions. And I think that that is a really good one. What we tend to do is have the visuals available somewhere like on the fridge that the kids can access. And then just when we're kind of really focusing on developing emotional vocabulary, we'll make it part of our daily routine. So maybe like either in the morning or after school, we'll all visit the poster and say like how we're feeling in that moment. And then you can use it as an opportunity to model. And if you've got other adults present, other kids present, then you all get the chance to model. And often when kids start off doing that, they'll get it wrong, like they'll point to the picture of sad and you can see that they're really excited. So you might say, oh, you're feeling sad. It looks to me like you feel excited. So you can just kind of explore those sorts of things.
Yeah.
But it is a kind of a process. And I would say just in response to that, verbally expressing your emotions, that is something that's really hard for adults as well. It's not necessarily something that's going to come easily, and of course you can work towards that, but I think I really am a fan of what we call total communication, which means knowing that all communication is valid. And actually, if you can teach some Makaton signs for different emotions, if you can have access to this poster on the fridge for different emotions, and maybe use some words sometimes, but your child knows that it's acceptable, that they can express themselves in whatever way, I feel like that functional communication is more of the goal than actually just being able to say the words.
It's funny, isn't it? Because like you said, it's even difficult for adults to work out how they're feeling. And I see a therapist. I've mentioned that on the podcast before. And one of the things that we had to address fairly early on in our sessions was exactly how I was feeling about certain things, and working out that something that I was actually expressing as guilt was in fact shame. And knowing the difference, even the intricacies and differences between those two specific emotions was quite an interesting one. So getting a child to verbally describe how they feel anyway is difficult when you can muddle up those two specific emotions as an adult as well. So like my eldest, if she feels that she's done something wrong, will take herself away, and I know, because I've been there as a child myself, having found out that I probably have ADHD myself, is that this huge emotional swell is probably actually shame that she did the thing in the first place. And she even expresses herself as feeling guilty about having got frustrated and shouted at her sister or whatever. And so I can now help her express that feeling slightly differently. But one thing we don't have is a poster of emotions up in the house, but my sister-in-law does. And so actually I think that's probably something that we'll happily implement, so that the younger two can really express the way they're feeling as well. So it sounds like this particular listener is already on the right path. It's just actually being able to spend maybe a bit more time and have that chance for understanding and really discussing and opening up about the way they're feeling.
So Yeah, just to summarize like kind of the top points there, I think continue to like model your own emotions and maybe
Yeah.
use the poster as part of a routine,
Mm,
like them solve the emotions that your child has felt, but maybe after the event rather than in the moment. Focus
yeah.
just on kind of regulation in the moment. And then maybe not putting speech and expressive communication on a pedestal, and actually just accepting that if your child's able to use any form of communication to express themselves, then that's great.
Yeah. No, fantastic. Um, we had another question in, didn't we, Charlotte, from one of our listeners, and that was, at what age can they realistically and accurately judge if a child is behind? So, I mean, that's a very broad question, because it could be, is that child behind in sounds? Is that child behind in vocabulary? But I mean, it seemed to me from our initial assessment when Usler was 3 that actually it's you've got those sounds that are sort of like plotted according to even younger ages as well,
Yeah.
aren't there? So I'm guessing it's actually sort of like fairly easy to tell from quite early on.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and there's lots to kind of unpick in there. I think firstly, I just want to address the word behind.
Mm,
I find it really difficult to think of, these ideas of things being wrong. And even, in the medical terminology within speech therapy, we use the terms like difficulties and disorders and that sort of thing. And actually, like, I really prefer to use the term difference.
yeah,
I'm quite you know neurodiversity affirming, like thinking about things following a different pattern of development. So I feel more comfortable saying like we can see if things are following maybe a different pattern of development really early on actually,
yeah,
because when we're thinking about kind of speech and language differences, as I mentioned before, we're thinking about lots of things, including like social interaction skills. And it is possible with some young babies that we might notice that they are not um, turning their head to hear sounds, that they're not maybe focusing on people's faces. And actually, most babies do those things in the first few months of life. They're not doing things like maybe smiling.
yeah,
And then babies tend to coo initially, which is those open vowel sounds like wah, and then later on they start to babble, ma 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 ba ba ba, and then children tend to say their first words. Huge variation on this, but somewhere between 10 and 15 months. So really, if children aren't meeting all of those early milestones, then it's an indication that their speech and language is following a different pattern of development. And there may be local variation at like a minimum age in which you can make an onward referral to speech and language therapy. You'd have to go to your local speech and language therapy team to see that. But also you'll have seen, of course, in the media, the importance of early intervention and supporting children when they're young because their brains are still developing. So for me, I could see if a child's following a different pattern of development from very early age,
yeah.
pre-1, I could notice that. And when I'm saying that, like, I think people then panic, well, I can't get a speech therapy referral, but early intervention includes all all sorts of positive support. So that includes parents thinking, oh, I think that my child might be following a slightly different pattern of development here. Why don't I educate myself as to what I can be doing at home? Why don't I make sure I have this one-to-one time with my child, because they might need it more than some other kids? Why don't I start using additional visuals around the house, because my child might need that more than some other kids? So it's a case of just, like thinking about what you can be doing within like the scope of what you've got. If your child's going to nursery or childcare or school, I'm going to actually proactively go and say to them, I think that there's something going on here. What can we do about it? Can we make a plan? And this is all covered in like the bite-sized bits of my podcast. It's a lot to
Yeah.
kind of think about all at once. But, I think you've touched on already, Louise, that as a parent, you often have to be a bit of an advocate, and it can be really overwhelming, particularly if you don't really know what you're talking about. It can be a bit intimidating, but we've
Oh,
got to use the resources that we have. And so, in, I think it's episode 3, I talk about why I recommend that you share information with your child's school. And that involves things like write yourself a list on your phone of the things that you want to share, the things that you want to tell them, the things that you want to ask them. And also make sure that I think you were on another live, Louise, actually, where I discussed this, and you were saying this is really helpful for me. Like,
Yes.
actually get them to agree to an action plan. If that action is that they say that they just want to wait and see or monitor for a bit, you say, okay, how long are you going to monitor for? When are we going to meet again?
It's funny, my mum was a primary school teacher for like 40 years, and she would always go, even like to doctor's appointments, with like a little notepad. So when the doctor was saying, like, how often to take the antibiotics, or what steps to take next, she'd write notes, because she was always like, you're in this situation, it's out of your comfort zone, you're not the subject matter expert, they are. And you've somehow got to retain this information. So by taking notes, it means that I could refer back to it and know and remember, yes, okay, it says how many times to take the antibiotics on the label, but they might have given you like a little hint or a tip, or said, stick it in a glass of squash or whatever to make it taste more palatable. And so she was like, I always take a notepad. And I think that was one of the things that really threw me off on my first parents' evening, was literally, you have not even 10 minutes with this class teacher. The session before is probably overrun. You're already 10 minutes late because everything's running late anyway. And then you've got to quickly dissect your child's, progress over the course of the last 6 months in not even 10 minutes. So yeah, like you said, by going with a list of questions, or even going with a notepad so you can write down what they're saying about your child and refer back to it and report back to your partner, who wasn't able to come with you probably, it means that in that really weird focused time, you can actually like properly communicate your concerns and take down theirs. And yeah, that honestly, that piece of advice was so helpful for me, because the amount of sort of like, I've had a couple of phone calls with the SENCO, and a lot of them have sort of been like off the cuff telephone calls that have just sort of come out of nowhere, no particular appointment's been booked. And so making sure that I had a notepad near me so that I could write down what she was saying, the advice she was giving, and things like that, was really helpful, because it meant that I could dissect that and look back over it with my partner later on. But it's really difficult, isn't it, when you're not the subject matter expert, and all of a sudden you've got to learn about all these new things that you didn't even think you had to learn about. Like Kat Sim said on our podcast a couple of weeks ago, like she said, I leave the knowledge to the professionals. I'm not a gynecologist, I don't know about down there. So I'll seek out the help of a professional who understands what they're talking about, so that I'm not sitting there trying to just like make up my own mind about whatever I have to do next. I'm talking to someone who actually understands the issue and has the experience. And I think that's something that, when we're brand new to parenting, and a lot of the children's services have sort of fallen off a cliff, as it were, as well, it means that we don't necessarily know where to go, or what to do next. And that's the point of both of our podcasts, is people can find you and learn about your speech therapy, about speech therapy and what to do while they're waiting. But the whole point and whole premise of this one was so people could go find the information without being judged, have a safe space to learn about the thing that they needed to learn about. And honestly, I think like this particular episode is going to be so helpful for a number of people who are listening today, who are struggling with knowing what to do next, or even accessing the services in the first place. It's just a tricky minefield, isn't it, trying to work out what to do.
So in episode 2 of my podcast, that's about like the referrals. So that's a really useful one if you're not really sure who you need to be referred to, how you're going to go about doing that, because it is a bit of a minefield. And I know, Louise, when we were chatting before, you said that you didn't even know what a SENCO was before. So if anybody's been listening to that chat and is thinking, what is a SENCO? Special Educational Needs Coordinator. Each school should have one. and they tend to take like that liaison role between families, and just have an overview of any of the kids in the school who need any additional support, and know kind of either what they're doing, any onward referrals they're making, what they're doing within the school, what they're recommending parents should be doing. So they're a great person to liaise with. And I think, yeah, I did a whole episode about like why I think it's good to share information, because I've had so many parents recently saying to me, and I wonder if you were in this position, Louise, that they just, you know, they thought there was something going on with their child, but they wanted to see if the school was going to mention it to them.
Yeah.
And I get that, I do, but also there's a lot of kids usually in a school, and kids don't present the same as they do at home often, particularly if they're new in school and there's a class of 30 kids. They might just be quite shy and quiet, and then that teacher's not necessarily going to know the full extent of their communication skills. So if you've got information about your child that you think might be beneficial to the school, I really would urge you to share and not sit around and wait. And then it means also that you don't get into the situation that you're in now, Louise, where you're like, oh, I think that there might be something going on, and they're like, yeah, we know. It's like, what are you going to tell me? No, like, just opening up the discussion says, like, I'm here, I'm ready for it, I want to do something, I want to be proactive. If you're telling me that something's different, that's okay. Like, let's just do something about it. Let's not just sit and wait.
Well, so with the whole speech and language thing, I did bring it up when she started in reception. They said they'd keep an eye on it, but they weren't doing home visits for new starters to the school anymore. It was all done over the telephone, and so I was at work when this phone call happened, and again it was literally like a 10-minute call to quickly introduce the two teachers who would be teaching the class, and all of that sort of stuff. And again, because it was a job share environment, it meant that one teacher saw them for 3 days a week and the other saw them for 2, and so they weren't getting like a prolonged amount of time with one particular teacher who would monitor them and make sure everything was okay. And so although she had been raised to the SENCO, it you know, as we know, speech and language was thoroughly underserved anyway within our community, at least. And so it meant that, you know, she was being monitored by the SENCO, but I wasn't hearing anything about it. And then when she started in year 1, about halfway through year 1, I get, oh, I've had to move her to another place in the class. She was just being too chatty with the person she was sat next to. Right, okay. Oh, I've had to move her again because she's now sitting next to this person because she was being too chatty with this person. And then my sister was going through her own issues with her son at school, finding out that he was presenting very typical boy ADHD sort of like behaviours. So he'd been flagged by the SENCO, you know, he's you know, typical ADHD, we're going to look at getting him a referral. Whereas my daughter was chatty, she was very engaged in certain subjects, completely not taking part or paying attention in others. If she'd been sat for too long, she'd need to have a little dance break around the classroom. But because she wasn't throwing pencils at people or being directly abusive or whatever, it meant that she wasn't flagged as a behavioural issue. It wasn't flagged as a behavioural issue. And because it wasn't flagged as a behavioural issue, they didn't see it as any sort of sign of ADHD at all. And so it meant that I then had to advocate for her, as, you know, like during my research to help my sister learn more about ADHD in children anyway, I stumbled upon the signs of ADHD in girls. And that's when I started to go, oh, okay, well, this is me. And Asla does these things as well. And so it meant that I was more knowledgeable. I spent the time learning to then be able to advocate on her behalf. And honestly, that's what takes most of the time as parents, isn't it? You know, we're working full time, we're running the house, we're looking after the children's social calendar as well as our own. And then on top of that, we're expected to learn about all of these things as well. And her class teacher sort of wasn't aware of the signs of ADHD in girls, and these complaints from the same teacher continued into year 2. And so she's been lucky enough to have the same teacher across year 1 and year 2, which has meant that the teacher's then been able to go, oh, actually, yeah, I now recognise these as signs because I've also done my homework to work out if this is a possibility. But previous to that, she hadn't logged it as a behavioural issue. She hadn't seen it as being disruptive necessarily to the class, although she was being disruptive because she was being too chatty. And so hadn't raised the idea of her having ADHD to the SENCO. So it was actually my responsibility to raise that as a potential issue with the school. So that was
I think it is a hard one, because as a parent, you sometimes just feel like, you know what, enough. There should be a professional here to deal with this. But then actually, at the end of the day, no one knows your child better than you, and no one is as invested in your child as you. So the reality of it is that we do need to be our kids' biggest advocates. Like, we're the ones who are most invested in them. And you shouldn't have to do it alone. It takes a village, you know. There are people out there, even if it is me, if you haven't got access to a speech therapist of your own, come to me, reach out to me, listen to my podcast. I can help, but you'll need to do something too.
Yeah. So I always sort of guess that most of my listeners do actually follow my Instagram account as well, but you know, as you will probably know if you listen to the introduction episode of the podcast, you know, my sister and I were having this chat about what the village looks like, what that necessarily is now, and the village has changed. The village is different, and the village is people like yourself, you know, other professionals who are much more easy to access now that we have the existence of social media, but also like generally like the support network that you have with, you know, mum friends from school and people you've met at god awful baby groups and so on. So it's one of those things, isn't it? It's like, I think that was the hardest thing for us after we'd had children, was working out that the village might not necessarily be close family members because you live too far away from them now. But it, you know, just as, you know, the saying goes, you can't choose your family, but you can choose your friends. You can curate your own village. It is possible. And you know, that was the main premise of the podcast, was to help mums of all ages and stages curate that village, find the information that they need, find the help that they need, and be able to navigate whatever stage they are of parenting and or life, really.
Oh, Louise, I love that so much. And that, like, as a parent, I have needed that village so many times. And if anyone is listening and wants me to be in their village, it would be just such a privilege, because I feel like, you know, I have needed other people in my village. And if I can offer my expertise as a speech and language therapist to somebody who needs it, that is just so important.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Charlotte. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you are in need of help, please do follow Charlotte on Instagram. She's at Speech Therapy with Charlotte. You can access her podcast from her Instagram account, but if you do want to search for it, it's just 3 things. I will also link to it in the bio for this podcast. So, you know, whatever device you're listening on, whatever app you're listening on, you'll be able to click the link and access her podcast and her Instagram account from here as well. And, you know, just honestly, guys, I really hope that this episode has helped you. I hope that you do follow Charlotte and that you do, you know, contact her, ask any questions that you might have post this episode. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you.
And you, thanks, Louise, and good luck with everything with your kids.
Thank you so much. Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode of Mum's Work and Chaos, please make sure to subscribe on whatever podcasting channel you're listening on at the moment. Or if you'd like to get involved, feel free to email me at mumsworkandchaos@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram at mumsworkandchaos. See you then.